Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of our friends dialing from all over the world. My name is Steve Mader, and you are here for what is going to be the penultimate POTOO Academy webinar. So we've been having a couple of these over the last 6 months or so. So we're absolutely delighted to see many recurring faces, many familiar faces. We have a public chat going. So please feel free to comment. Lindsay, our moderator, is in there to address any questions and to wield the ban hammer in case anyone has anything inappropriate to say, because some people may be overly excited with some candy. I know I personally am. So welcome. We have a lot to cover for the next 45 minutes or so. It's a very, very broad conversation, but we've highlighted some of the things that we think are the most interesting around marketplace org structure. Now, for those of you who are new to POTOO, really quick background on us. We are a marketplace analytics company. We focus on analytics and supporting brands on how to be successful on third-party marketplaces from a brand protection point of view. Now, along that journey, there's lots of different ways that we have realized that many people who are in charge of marketplaces or brand protection, they are all interested on what's happening from a data point of view. What are my competitors doing? What am I seeing from a sellout? What's happening across borders? So what we've created is a marketplace analytics platform, which allows you to track and understand your performance primarily on third-party marketplaces, not the 1P side of things. We're focused very much on the 3P and helping you be successful there. We've had a bit of a journey with the POTOO Academy so far. So if you go to our website, we will be able to show you all of the different webinars that we've got. We've built a bit of a story over the past 6 months or so, helping brands navigate through, oh my gosh, my POs have been shut off on Amazon. What do I do now? So we've built an entire storyline around, what do you do when your distribution has been disrupted? How do you build an authorized seller program? How do you build a brand protection program? How do you use marketplaces to expand in different countries? And then what we had last month was around Walmart marketplace and what they're investing in and what the role of that specific channel is for Walmart. For those of you that are having some potential sound challenges, this is a potential Demio problem, which is our webinar platform. So please just refresh the tab or log back in, and it should correct itself. It's a known bug with the platform there. So it's a little bit of housekeeping. Everyone's going to get the recording and slides. We do have a live chat going, so please ask questions there. We've also got a couple polls going as well. I'm very delighted to be able to introduce a good friend of ours, Andy Davies from Vertical Advantage. I'm going to do a disservice introducing him, so I'll go ahead and let him spend a couple seconds introducing himself.
Thank you. Great to be here. I don't doubt you would have done an introduction, but yeah, as Stephen said, I'm a director at Vertical Advantage, manage our e-commerce and digital team. We're a recruitment agency, fairly kind of boutique, I guess, specialist within the consumer space. Mainly kind of main buckets for us really CPG brands and then any kind of service providers, supporting those brands from an e-com and digital perspective. We do have a big supply chain and ops division as well, which sits separately for us. And yeah, I've been recruiting in this space now. We've been going about 8 years. I've been at the business for about 7.5, so majority of that time. And e-commerce and digital wasn't a part of our business when we founded it. Most of our clients, it was an afterthought for them and has kind of grown massively. So I've probably done it for the last 5 years, pretty much. And probably feel like I've learned more in the last 6 months than I have in the previous 4.5 years, pretty much. So yeah, hopefully some useful insights to share.
Absolutely. So Andy is going to be chipping in throughout, and we've got a dedicated session towards the back half of the next 45 minutes or so, where we're going to discuss some backgrounds of folks and the ways that other organizations are starting to invest in this specific space. Fantastic. So that brings us to our very first poll. We've got so many different folks on the phone at the moment. So we've got some retailers on the phone. We've got some global brands on the phone. We've got some disruptor brands on the phone. We have some agencies, some consultancies, little bits of everything, which is amazing. But for those of you that are building a marketplace organization or starting to put the foundations in place, why exactly are you looking at this at the moment? There's so many different ways that you're starting to come at this. What's the number one reason for you about why you're interested in exploring marketplace? We see the polls are going, fantastic. If it has not switched for you on the right-hand side of the platform, there's a little tab next to the chat button where you can go up and see. Interesting. So exactly as we predicted, which is kind of why we've built this the way we have, which is good validation, it's little bits of everything. But there are two that seem to be winning. So number one, market expansion. How do I either A, expand my category into new profitable white spaces through marketplaces, whether that's because my 1P has been crapped out on Amazon, I need to find new profitable ways to drive the category, or potentially little bits of everything. We don't know what we want to do quite yet. So we're going to experiment and see where we go, but we need dedicated focus on it. And I think that's really, really key, is that, when we've been building out the last month or so, the background information on this webinar, we thought we were going to have an amazing unified theory of all things marketplace organization. And what we've realized, mining job postings from Indeed and LinkedIn, or talking to many of our clients and many of our partners who are in the marketplace space, obviously, we've found that there's so many different stages that every single company is on, depending on where they've come from, how big their D2C business is. Are they a category leader or are they a category upstart? Like it all depends. And what we've built is essentially a big list of jobs to be done, so that regardless of where you are on the journey, you have a place to be able to look and say, all right, here's the 5 or 6 things that I need foundationally to be able to go into. So for the next half an hour or so, this is where we're going to go on our journey. So we're going to look a little bit around where we've come from and why we're seeing organizations invest in marketplaces from an org point of view a little bit outside of the standard way that we're investing in e-commerce or Amazon or other traditional channels. We'll be looking at the jobs to be done, where we're going, and the things that need to be in place to ensure we're successful in growing e-commerce through marketplaces. Third, we're going to look at the skill set. Who's going to actually drive this? What's their background? Who do I go after? Where should they sit in the organization? Where orgs are sitting, or where orgs are investing? And then we'll do a bit of Q&A. Okay. So where we've come from, right? So on average, I know this is a gross generalization, but on average, many large CPG brands, many of you are on the line at the moment, have followed roughly the same path over the last 5, 7, or even 10 years, right? So you've gone from a traditional large scale, big trucks, big DCs, big stores, big strategic partners, Walmart and Tesco and Carrefour, et cetera, and moving into an e-commerce world, you've followed roughly the same trajectory of, I have a handful of champions whose job it is to advocate for new ways of thinking about growing through e-commerce. So they're exploring new things. They're constantly fighting battles. They have to prove the growth works before they can get resources. They're constantly under-resourced. They're always getting in trouble for breaking something. They grew too fast on Amazon and Tesco's mad at them. They grew too fast on Amazon and they've been crapped out because it was on offer somewhere else and we lost the buy box and it went way down. It's primarily sales, given that they're chasing a customer in this space, a little bit of marketing, and supply chain is always the enemy. The supply chain is always saying no. They don't have the right case pack sizes. They don't have the right types of e-commerce packs. It's always a disaster. So 4 or 5 people, champions. Once we get enough critical mass, or some at the C-level is like, there's this thing called Amazon. We got to pay attention to them. We start thinking about creating global centers of excellence, global teams, and really moving into the acceleration phase. This is where these champions may come together, form a proper global team, And then they start creating more formalized processes across the business. So we start thinking internal networks, internal stakeholder mapping, right? We lift and shift campaigns through a steering committee, through a global network of saying, this worked really, really well in Germany. Let's see if we can replicate that in Spain or lift it to the US. They start to prioritize global partners. That could be Amazon, that could be Tmall, that could be JD.com, it could be Walmart in the US, for example. The P&L still sits in market. The COE has the ability to influence the strategic direction or the frameworks of which the local markets does their business planning. However, the global teams don't necessarily own the P&L. It's more influences over the P&L. And then they own some technology rollouts like PIM systems, asset management systems, shelf compliance, shelf analytics, e-commerce analytics, things like that. Where we move into next, which is where we have been for probably the last year or two for many companies, is around the embedded capabilities and scaling phase. This is where the company essentially says, the global team, while amazing and fantastic, we're not moving fast enough. We need to embed local capabilities so we can move even faster. So we start thinking, global strategy, regional teams, a regional layer that coordinates media campaigns and best practices and potentially European relationships with an Amazon, for example. And the local team actually gets stuff done. This is where you have local search folks, local content optimization. You've got local key account managers calling on Amazon. You've got local supply chain innovation folks. E-commerce and Amazon starts to become a normal channel. Most likely there's a D2C channel in here somewhere. It could be a transactional D2C, or it could just be more from a marketing point of view. All of the go-to-market processes start to get done at scale. And since so many of those go-to-market processes around joint business planning, BU level budgeting, category innovation, all those really big, meaty CPG processes, all of those are usually 2 to 3 year long processes with how it comes to market. So once you've gone from accelerating into scaling, you start to actually see the benefits of all of that hard work you put in 2 or 3 years in the past. So all that's starting to pay off, so we're scaling. And then the question becomes, well, growth is actually relatively easy. How do we do it profitably, right? So then the question becomes a little bit less, stop fueling top line just for the sake of fueling top line and share it. Now, how do I grow profitably? So what we then do is create an overly simplistic 4-box model to describe where growth comes from, because I have spent too many years as a consultant and I just can't help myself from creating a 4-box model. So what we essentially look at are how CPG companies grow. We've got, things that we sell, old and new, and then places with which we sell it or where we sell it. So either old places or new places, essentially, right? So when we start thinking about, okay, how can I start to drive category or portfolio innovation and start thinking new things in old places? We start thinking about, okay, Mondelez snack futures, all about what's the future of snacking. I'm going to invest money in food startups, small disruptive brands to determine what's going to grow the category and ensure that we're giving them the right enablement to accelerate through the channels with which we're comfortable, with things like Amazon, for example. We then start to think, okay, how do I start to think new things in new places? This is a great example around Lego Ventures, for example, where they're taking it a step further, not just investing in startups or investing in ancillary categories. They're thinking, how do I completely redefine the category of play? Because of course it's Lego. How do I redefine the category of play? It's not just bricks, it's not just Lego sets, it's the entire play experience. How do I invest and grow the definition of play with companies that are doing that and education organizations that are doing that, so that all boats are floating in this space for children? We also start to think, okay, well, how can I bring things that are already in my portfolio into places I'm comfortable with? This is essentially lifting and shifting my regional or ethnic assortment, or products that may be working in the UK, I'll bring them to France or into Germany, or vice versa, right? So it's existing portfolio, existing products in places that we're comfortable with through market expansion opportunities or white space opportunities. And then finally, we start to think, well, okay, how can I then take my existing portfolio and then do new routes to consumer, new ways with which I can get my products to my shoppers? And that tends to be things like Amazon Marketplace. It could be Lazada in Southeast Asia. It could be Deliveroo, food delivery and instant delivery. It could be things like Instacart, again, kind of this intermediary in between. And this, up until the pandemic, has tended to be where many companies are situated, right? We're thinking new portfolio, redefinition of the category, lifting and shifting for incremental opportunities, and then how do I resource against new routes to consumer, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then many of you were deemed non-essential, and Amazon shut off all of your POs, which blew up this entire economic model, right? Which is what we've seen through some of our polls, for example. So then you start to think, well, okay, if I can no longer grow through an Amazon, for example, who is my primary source of top line growth, what do I do? So then you start to think, okay, I need to start looking for new sources of growth, but I can't just look at these new sources of growth through the here and now, incremental go, go, go. It needs to be a little bit longer term thinking, right? Because this is a bit of a shock to the system. And when we were doing our interviews around why have you built a marketplace organization, I was actually quite surprised that it was much less around the tactical, there's an opportunity, and much more around the long-term planning, long-term thinking of this is where retail's moving. The economics make sense for the retailers. It's how we need to expand our portfolio globally. As we move into APAC, for example, this is the only way to do it. And the ability for the CPG brands we were talking to think long-term was incredible and absolutely fantastic and really refreshing to see. So what you start to think about is, okay, I need to map my segmentation of these channels much longer term than just thinking here and now. So on the vertical axis here, we've got audience growth, essentially. So we need to start thinking incrementality. So 3 years out, work backwards, where's the largest amount of growth in my potential audience? Notice I didn't say shoppers or consumers, specific to audience, because it's half media, half shoppers. Where's that growth going to come from? And then the horizontal axis is around category growth. So it may have incredible audience growth, huge amounts of eyeballs and traffic, but it may not be a very conducive channel for my specific category. So we need to be able to map that as well. So then you start thinking, okay, for the business models with which I understand, how do I map it against here? So we've got relatively high audience growth for pure play e-commerce, right? Relatively high category growth, fantastic. We've got category specialists, potential high audience growth continuing, maybe, maybe not. Potential low category growth, questionable, right? So when we're looking at this, we're thinking, okay, offline grocers potentially could increase through online grocery. Category specialists could increase through marketplace, which what we're seeing in many different countries. But these are core business models which we understand. When you then start mapping all the new ways with which we can talk to consumers and reach audiences, we start thinking social commerce, we start thinking fast delivery platforms like Uber and Instacart, we start thinking about marketplace and 3P, right? And all of these are new business models with which most CPG companies, most apparel companies, and most large brands do not have the history or the pedigree of really being able to internalize the economics of how these different businesses work, both from a media optimization, a campaign integration, or just a day-to-day sales P&L operational point of view. And that could be because 3P marketplace could be owned by marketing, it could be owned by sales. All we know is that there's no buying team with which you can communicate with, so it potentially falls through the cracks, which is why we're talking audience here instead of shoppers. So it's incredibly important that as you start thinking about mapping future growth with your category in mind, we start thinking, what channels am I comfortable with? I'll keep that as the as is bucket. And then what channels do I need to invest in growth with? And then keep them a little bit separate. And what we have found as we've been doing this research, and I mean, I've been, a consultant in the e-commerce space for 15 years now, is for the vast majority of folks that we're talking to, Amazon is 1P in particular has now become standard operating procedure. It's just the same as you were talking to Tesco, same as you're talking to Costco, right? Exactly the same. However, Instacart or Just Eat or some of the fast food ones, a little bit different, no longer comfortable, a little bit of friction inducing, right? So Because we need to do that, it's a little bit difficult, we need to keep them separate. So what we're seeing now is, for the same reasons that Amazon was kept separate from the cadence with which the core business ran 5 years ago, we kept the Amazon team separate. Most companies have internalized that now and are now looking at, well, how can I explore these orange buckets in a separate team dedicated? Yeah. So as we're doing our interviews, we realized that there was 4 primary reasons why brands are resourcing as marketplace and digital platforms. So the first one is all of this growth that we've been having has been introducing friction, and that friction is coming from P&L challenges. We don't have SDAs in place with distributors, so it's causing chaos from a volume leakage point of view. We don't understand item level economics, so when we start thinking about, going 1P with traditional JBP trade terms, and then start thinking, well, how do I compare that with FBA costs and then, media attribution? They can't do the apples to apples comparison to determine which SKU should go in 1P versus 3P. So all that friction has been created. I need to have a dedicated team that looks at it. There's no budget dedicated to marketplaces like an Instacart or to an Amazon 3P or to a Lazada, because many brands are still budgeting the way that they're activating media campaigns on these platforms through the trade budget and through the customer P&L. But if there's no customer P&L, how does that work from a trade budget point of view? I have to then allocate media dollars instead of marketing budget instead. And some companies are still not set up to do that. So we need to create a dedicated team to help address the friction, remove the friction, and then scale what's working. Number 2 is we need to have better control over small scale NPD. Right. One of the benefits of Amazon, which many of us on the phone will know, where many of us are e-commerce ninjas and it's fantastic, is that you don't sell to Amazon really anymore as you sell through them, right? You are activating the levers. It's all in your control, as much self-service as you possibly can. Pull the levers, drive the sellout through to the end shopper, right? And from an NPD point of view, this is incredibly powerful because you can have essentially real-time results in, say, a week, not real-time, but a week or two, of are the campaigns performing really well? Is this item performing really, really well? If I'm 3P on Amazon through the marketplace, I can be in stock with only a pallet of product, right? Relatively inexpensive from a capital allocation point of view. So if it doesn't work, I can just delist it, change the pack around, change the solution around, co-bundle it with something else, put it back up and see if it's going to perform better, yes or no. To do that at scale through 1P or to do that at scale through traditional retail is millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of units on shelf, perhaps. So the ability to fail fast and learn is really, really important. And it also allows us to rapidly test and experiment in partnership with supply chain, what product economics make the most amount of sense, what bundle packs, what case pack size, what solution packs make the most amount of sense. Market expansion is also the number 3, and we saw that in the poll, actually, market expansion. That could be expansion through category expansion, or it could be pure, I would like to grow in Asia, I like to grow in India. Marketplace is the only way that I can do that. So I need to start figuring it out now, because in 5 years, that's going to be the only source of top line growth in many of those markets. So I need to figure it out now. So the big questions there around which 3PLs can rapidly expand across different geographies. With the growth of the new platforms like Lazada and Shopee, how does that relationship work between the brand, the media campaigns that are created from global and regional? How do key influencers work? We have these little tiny mini micro influencers which are popping up all over the place out of China, and we're seeing, Lazada in its ownership from Alibaba starting to permeate that type of campaign activation and brand activation to other markets. Do we have a key influencer strategy in our e-commerce strategy for Asia, for Southeast Asia, for example? And then finally, number 4, data. Actually not very high on our poll. Curious as to why. Maybe we'll have a bit conversation about that in the chat. Is increasingly we are seeing many brands obviously thirsty for data. The more data I have, the better decisions I can make. the more data that I can collect from my primary shoppers, my primary loyal shoppers, the better of a potential relationship that I can have as a brand to communicate that equity through, right? And that's why we are seeing some brands start to put the marketplace team under the D2C team, because they've realized it is much less about sales and much more about brand equity, much more about integration with awareness driving campaigns and discovery campaigns and equity campaigns, and much more around the data that I can get and leverage back into my own business. Okay. That's where we've come from, right? A big, long journey, but it's essentially saying that so many of the challenges that we're having now with marketplaces is friction inducing to the rest of our go-to-market strategy, which is why it needs to be kept a little bit separate from the rest of the business to figure this stuff out. So where are we going? Many of you have seen my little board guy here before. And what we've seen, and again, all of these interviews that we've been having over the past month or two, is that for many e-commerce leaders, they're feeling, especially now, under pressure to not only grow, but grow profitably. And the only way that they can grow profitably is to fix what the growth broke in the business, right? And that could be because we've got volume leakages and distribution leakages all over the place. So the top line growth on Amazon, the dumping a bucket of money into AMS on Amazon has created havoc with pointing traffic at distribution challenges on Amazon. Or it could be around the fact that our portfolio is just crapping out everywhere because we don't have a fit for purpose e-commerce distribution strategy. We don't have a fit for purpose e-pack, or we're not in frustration-free packaging, things like that. And what we've realized is the size of the company does not matter. The jobs to be done are still the same. It just depends on A, how many categories you have, and does each single category and brand within it have its own e-commerce team, or is it a unified team across all brands and all categories? Is the e-commerce team half ahead? Is there still a global COE in place, or is it everything localized? And then how integrated is it with D2C? Regardless of where the team sits, what we have found is the jobs to be done are still the same. And when we've been mining a lot of the job postings, we've realized that it doesn't matter where the job sits, where the function sits, the jobs to be done are still exactly the same. It's been really fascinating to see. So no surprise, we're seeing 3 tiers of buckets for headcount that we see getting hired in. And Andy, please feel free to chip in if you see anything here at all. We're seeing it from a global point of view. We're seeing 3 heads pop up. One is head of marketplace, one is head of digital platforms, and then one is head of fast fulfillment, but that's a little bit subservient to the other 2. That's still kind of, Instacart and Uber and things like that. From a local point of view, we are seeing from the executional side, marketplace sales director postings, and we're seeing marketplace manager postings. And to be totally frank, these are essentially exactly the same verbatim as what you'll see for a digital shelf manager, an Amazon key account manager, except it's a little bit less on the commercial side and a little bit more on the relationship side, both internal across categories, across brands, but also external with 3Ps instead of a buying team. There's very little regionality, what we've seen so far, at least in Europe and North America. From APAC, we are seeing more from a regional point of view, obviously because it's APAC hubs. It tends to be somewhat regional as well. But we are seeing a little bit more around regional relationships with TikTok, regional relationships with social commerce platforms popping up out of APAC. Andy, is this kind of pinging off of what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, pretty much. And I would say the majority of the clients that we work with are still very early on with this process, and like that, it's when you say it's stuff you're seeing, it's what we're seeing is it's only just, we're only just kind of seeing this. There's a couple of brands who've been doing it for a while, but yeah, it's still all pretty recent. I guess the other thing we're seeing that I know we'll probably come on to talk about a bit later is actually in the kind of immediacy of the last 6 months is we'll outsource as much as we possibly can right now and make this decision later. So actually, what we're also seeing is no decision being made on this whatsoever, and the quickest way to gain traction and knowledge is use an agency, use someone else to do this for us, and then we'll figure it out further down the line. So yeah, we've probably seen as much of that as anything.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating because it's exactly the same arc as we saw with Amazon 1P years ago. It's a little bit sticky. It's going to move too fast. I can't do it myself. I need as much external help as we possibly can. I'm going to outsource it to my Google agency.
Yeah.
And then, all of you will know how that ends up cascading if you've got your Google agency also working on AMS, for example, with Amazon. So we're seeing that internalize. So you're absolutely correct. So we are seeing some outsourcing to both the Amazon agency, if you do have an Amazon agency to help manage 3P on Amazon, but also we're seeing a significant increase in 3PLs who are also becoming Amazon agencies as well. So they are also starting to not only buy the inventory from you as a strategic partner, but also trade the inventory on your behalf.
Yeah.
We talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Question from Jamie about APAC. That is Asia Pacific. So that in this context, it could be inclusive of China. It could be excluding China. It's primarily what I'll call, a hub out of Singapore that covers that specific region. So jobs to be done from a global point of view. And this is kind of aggregated from many of the different job specs that we've mined to get at this. Responsibilities include understanding the business model economics. Remember all of those orange buckets in our segmentation before, all of the new bits. It's understanding and building the economics, either with a global strategy function, if you have one in-house at your company, or it's with commercial excellence, if you have a commercial excellence or commercial development function in your business as well, who tends to shepherd the way that channels work within many large CPG companies. They also tend to own the relationship with key strategic platforms at a global level, if you're at that point, whether that's with Amazon or eBay or Lazada or some of the other social commerce platforms. Many of them are still thinking region by region, country by country. But if you are big enough and if it's the right platform, this company or this role tends to own that global relationship. They tend to also either need to create the selective distribution agreement for the 3Ps, or they need to optimize whatever SDA is already in place to be more e-commerce inclusive. They need to own the 3PL strategic framework around not just what the SDA includes, but also what will you as the brand provide to the 3PL in order to, help become value-added partners to that actual 3PL. They drive cross-category and cross-brand alignment internal. They tend to go across all of the different brands to create a proper cross-category strategy with specific platforms. They ensure that marketing planning and the marketing excellence function have these platforms as a potential endpoint as they're doing their budget allocation in the previous year. So for 2021, for example, it's ensuring that Amazon 3P, it's assuring that Instacart, and it's assuring that eBay, for example, is budgeted for, thought of in the campaign creation process and the budget planning process. They tend to also be the ones that have to define the KPIs for leadership, for executive leadership, and they need to be the one that tends to have to fight the fight around how much volume do I trade for profit? Going back to that conversation of it's very easy to grow in e-commerce. It's very difficult to grow profitably in e-commerce. And many of the challenges that we've been seeing around, oh my gosh, we have to wrangle the marketplace opportunity is I have too many 3Ps, too many rogue listings, they're all over the place, they're killing my profit. How do I trade volume? Because a lot of that's just because I've been driving volume for the last 5 years. How do I rein that back in and put more profit-centric KPIs around it? That requires buy-in from senior leadership, obviously. Then they also tend to own marketplace tech. That could be analytics. That could be a different type of PIM system. They tend to own brand protection software, and they also tend to own things like shelf compliance information as well.
The only thing I would add here for some of this stuff, and probably goes back to the last point, that is, I think it depends on how you're planning on getting into marketplace, how you're planning on building your presence on marketplace, as to what some of these responsibilities would be. And what I mean by that is actually the distinction between, do we want to take our existing brand portfolio and grow it on marketplace, or actually is our entry point into marketplace through acquisition and through a completely different portfolio, which you kind of, I know I've covered a bit there, but actually almost going one step further back, that massively impacts how you resource for it.
I think that's such a good point. So there are, thinking about, going back to that, what are the original 4-box models around, how are companies growing? So it's, potential new assortment, new portfolio within channels that I'm relatively familiar with. That could be, okay, I'm going to create an M&A arm, an incubation arm. I'm going to go off and acquire a digital native brand, which has been picking me apart slowly but surely, right? These are companies that have grown up on Instagram, Shopify, and Amazon 3P, right? Through FBA and stuff like that. I'm going to acquire them and there's 5 people. They are now my new hires. They're going to now be head of marketplace. So I think that's a really interesting approach as well. Yeah. Some of the business requirements to be successful, because there's jobs to be done. And then there's things that need to be in place either within the specific function or within the support network of the brand. So no surprise, to be successful, you need to have your content playbook. You need to have your search playbook. You need to have your DSP playbook. You need to have all of the normal things, which you do for 1P e-commerce success. Same thing for 3P, potentially a little bit different, given the fact that the merchandising opportunities on platforms are often very different, and you may be having to work through a distributor in order to actually merchandise appropriately. I would say that many companies now actually have a good critical mass of headcount. I feel, based on, again, anecdotal evidence of speaking to many of our partners that we interviewed for this, realizing that it's no longer just half a headcount scraping by for a little tiny bit. We are starting to see companies take this seriously and put a dedicated head, if not 2 or 3, against this opportunity, or even as far as Andy has said, I'm just going to go and buy a company who knows how to do this and internalize their capabilities. They need to have business partners be aligned to this function in much more of an integrated fashion. So they need to have legal business partners, supply chain business partners, and potentially someone from IT, from business partner point of view as well, for integration on the IT side of things. Needs to be flexibility and willingness to flex budget, especially since many of these platforms don't have trade support, trade budget, or trade marketing budget. So how do we actually activate if there's no budget to do it? So it requires allocation from media and marketing dollars to do it. They require leadership buy-in to make tough decisions. And the big one is around supply chain innovation. Remember, in that champion phase way back, it was supply chain was the enemy. Even though we're still thinking a little bit about marketplace champions, supply chain must be on board because it requires different pack sizes, flexibility of pack, being able to look at the economics of a specific item across different geographies, roll up that volume and say, yep, this makes sense. Or the willingness to say, we can't do it. Be okay saying, I'm done, and go to a 3PL to do that instead.
Yeah, and I think that that's a massive point for me, and one that is mentioned a bit further on, or we might come to talk about. But the discussion around where should it sit is much less relevant than the discussion around how kind of well backed it is. It's often clients will talk to us and say, should it sit in sales? Should it sit in marketing? Should it be how should we build it out? And the answer is kind of that doesn't really matter if the rest of the stuff doesn't work. It doesn't. People do it successfully in marketing and sales, pull it out into its own function. They all sometimes succeed and sometimes fail based on the underlying kind of culture of how everyone else buys into it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what we have seen a lot of digital native brands, for example, there is no difference between the D2C e-commerce team, the marketing e-commerce team, the commercial, it's all the same, which is one of the reasons why they can move so fast. So coming from a 10,000 person CPG brand, it may be very, very different because each single category may have exactly their own marketing team and e-commerce teams.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how, depending on the size of the company, where this function specifically sits doesn't necessarily matter. To your point, the underlying bits are what happens the most.
Yeah.
And from a local point of view, and then we'll go into a bit of the stakeholder alignment conversation. We were very surprised that it's essentially exactly the same from a marketplace manager as what we would see from an Amazon CAM, although there are one or two specific differences. So they own content compliance, they own item merchandising and uploads, where the brand does the upload as you know, versus the distributor does it. They tend to communicate SDAs, minimum, you know, MAP policies, and then the updates to the policies. They tend to own campaign executions with 3Ps. They tend to actually own the 3P relationship at a local by local level. So what I'm talking about, you know, is basically an Amazon key account manager, except it's no longer negotiation with a buyer. It's now relationships with the 3PLs. That's where a lot of the time goes into. They're also doing a lot of the execution of brand protection, IP, counterfeit, and trademark infringements. They're also working around sales performance tracking with the 3PLs in partnership. And then they're also providing assortment recommendations, just like they would do if they were doing this 1P as well. Business requirements to be successful, it's exactly the same as the global side. So we need to have standard content, search, and DSP playbooks. They need, not only does the local headcount, but the business itself needs to have a good understanding of item level profitability in context to how 1P works with an Amazon, for example, and then how 3P economics work with partnership with the 3PL, including search allocation, media budget allocation, and, you know, shipping cost allocation, for example. So if you don't have a really good understanding of item level profitability, understanding what should be 1P versus 3P, how do I lift and shift categories, that it becomes very difficult to do if you don't have the item level understanding. Thinking about, well, how do I activate budget if I don't have trade budget? How do I get that money? And then they tend to own the brand protection comms. They tend to own the communication escalation process. They don't create it. So they need to have a partner, whether that's a legal business partner, global head of, or work with an agency to create the comms process around brand protection. Okay. Essentially, I'll go to the next slide here, and then we'll go into a bit of a conversation. We've mapped this out to 7 key functions that the marketplace team needs to look at and work with in order to be successful. So we're not going to go through every single one of them, but the big key ones around the process owners that must be on board with where the marketplace org is going is commercial excellence and business development. So this is ensuring that the economics that we've been looking at as part of, you know, why we've kept this marketplace org separate, that team needs to be on board to ensure that the learnings are scaled into the entire organization. The way that we're thinking about NPD and portfolio is incredibly important. From a marketplace point of view, it's relatively cost effective to do NPD, less cash outlay, working capital is much lower. I've got 3Ps who could be very nimble. I don't have to be in 100 doors. I can be just in one DC. So being able to work with category planning and the marketing excellence function to be able to really quickly test NPD is one of the most important, crucial key success factors of having a fantastic marketplace organization. And then finally, it's working with supply chain, you know, our favorite nemesis, but also BFFs, right? Working with supply chain to be able to do bundle packs. And if we can't do bundle packs internally, it's working externally with a 3PL as part of the strategic framework to do bundle packs. And also drop shipping. Being able to identify which 3PLs can do drop shipping is becoming incredibly important. And being able to work with the retailer, whether it's a Walmart or a Target or, you know, an Amazon, to do drop shipping, incredibly important as well. Cool. Finally, we're going to look at some of the actual skill sets of folks that we see coming into this new organization, right? Talking about before, it doesn't really matter where it sits. it's a little bit more around, what job functions do they do? What's their day-to-day look like? What does their team structure look like? And, what's the appetite for the business? So Andy, I guess, what are you seeing about the types of profiles that many of your brands, many of your partners are looking for?
Yeah, I think the difficult thing about this is that the areas where I've seen it work really well when someone has hired a dedicated marketplace manager or head of marketplace, when they're the first person in, it's succeeded. The people who've succeeded, that have done the best, are the ones who've done so because of the kind of adaptability and almost individual brilliance of that person, which, from a resourcing and how we structure it perspective, it might not be particularly useful, but I think it's just the diversity of skills needed in that one person to make it a success. And I think that's where I would maybe say the slight difference versus an Amazon key account manager would be, is that, as you kind of alluded to, because now an Amazon key account manager role is such a well understood part of, a CPG's business structure, it's probably become a fairly kind of well-defined, not narrow, but narrower role than marketplace role. So and I think the reason why outsourcing often appeals is because to do it really well in one person, to begin with, if you say, right, we're just going to hire one to start with, you need someone who is probably, has all is strong commercially, but also is able to become a PPC specialist within, if it's Amazon, they need actually to become a real expert within PPC there, or be able to manage an agency that does that. Similarly with SEO, similarly with content, just kind of general optimization, design even. So the businesses who have done it well, I've seen, have hired someone actually who's probably got quite a broad background, has probably done some sales roles, some marketing roles, even people who've set up and managed their own business, their own e-commerce businesses, who then kind of understand supply chain ops, the 360 kind of building out of a marketplace or an e-commerce business. And to the other point we were making earlier around the internal stakeholder kind of piece, they're able to understand how that fits together. So it doesn't really matter where that person sits, but they're able to pull the strands that need to be pulled internally to get that functioning in the right way. So without wanting to kind of dodge the question, it's a really kind of, certainly if it's only one person, or certainly in the early days, the breadth of skills just has to be really, it has to be broad.
I think that's really interesting, right? Because we're often, going back to that, 50% of the e-commerce head, their time is built, building amazing things. The other half is fixing everything. And depending on where the organization is, you need to have someone who not only can know how all the new stuff works, but can translate why it's different into the rest of the business. So for many organizations, just hiring an e-commerce expert was very difficult to actually be successful when you start thinking about growing e-commerce, 10 years ago with Amazon. You need to actually have someone who understands Amazon, understands e-commerce, but also the impact and how it breaks everything else. And are you seeing then that, the roles that are being successful, if it is just the role of one, they need to have the 50-50 of digital expert and then brand expert?
Yeah, definitely. And again, that comes probably back. So I'm just there's some points that we'll cover from this slide. I won't go through it in order. And also, this is a good example of the difference between someone who's been a consultant for 15 years and someone who just works in recruitment, because my slide is, one basic slide with a few notes on. But yeah, I think that point depends entirely, again, on what your objective is, as in how much do you need kind of to maintain brand equity when you're growing on marketplaces? Because I think for a lot of bigger CPGs, that's maybe something that they don't get their head around, is actually brand probably plays less of a part than just, certainly early on, just like incredible execution and the ability to iterate really fast and understand, like, day to day, why am I changing in search rankings? Why am, what's not working? How do I fix it? And to just that test and learn and mentality and the ability to work at pace is more important. And actually, there are so many brands who've grown so successfully who no one really knows who the brand is, right? Like, that's the beauty of a marketplace, is that it's being able to deliver all of those other things without actually having to invest in the brand itself. And that, I think, for bigger CPGs is a big mindset shift, because you have to actually I think you need to understand that to begin with. How important is it for us to, for the brand to be successful, or how important is it for us just to make profit?
Absolutely. Question coming in from Luke, actually. As you're having a conversation with, going into a brand and talking about where their aspirations are for their marketplace or their e-commerce org, are you having KPI conversations at all about what the actual definition of success for that org is?
Yes, to an extent, but again, it probably comes back to the point I've just made around, I think from our perspective, from what I've seen as a recruitment company, we kind of have, over the years, we've had clients that fall into one of two distinct categories when it comes to e-commerce and this specifically, and that's bigger brands who've always focused more on first party. If it comes to Amazon, their vendor, they've probably got a, part of the SPS scheme or AVF scheme or whatever it's called now, and invest heavily in that, but marketplace is not even a consideration. And brands who are the complete opposite, where they have grown up on marketplaces and that's what they're all about. But the success for each of them is always very different. If it's the marketplace native, it's always about margin and profitability. And as I said, like, the brand itself doesn't matter if no one even knows what the brand is, right? For the biggest CPGs, I think that's where they struggle. And sometimes if we ask them what are the KPIs for the role, they probably can be a bit fluffy, because they say, we're not really sure, it's a test and learn and understand, and actually we need to, we haven't figured out how much that's about being present here because we feel like we should be, or how much of that's going to kind of bite into our traditional business with Amazon or whoever else we work with. So I would say I couldn't define what success is, because it's so dependent on the brand itself. But I think actually the bigger businesses have that we've worked with probably had a bit less of an idea, and it's more about this person has to determine that.
I completely agree. And you kind of see that from the poll, right? Is why are you building the organization? Little bits of everything. We don't really know why quite yet. We're going to try everything and see what works for our specific brand. And a lot of it comes down from what's been the primary pain point of why you need to invest in this. Is it because your distribution is all over the place? In which case the success is more around known, authorized, and attributable 1P or authorized 3P sales, right? So I need to be able to know more of the universe from a shopper experience point of view to ensure it's the right product and it's a known product. So it's attributable 1P sales. It could be market expansion. So it could be, how can I expand top line growth profitably through marketplaces where I don't have boots on the ground, I don't have headcount on the ground. And then the third one is very much around potentially, and depends on how robust the data is, it's around how do I capture incremental new audiences that may not be on my existing platforms, my existing customers, my existing Walmart or Target or Tesco. So it's how can I work with, a Zalando or something where I may not already be listed in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Cool.
Completely agree. Some of the other stuff on here, I think we've as I said, we've kind of jumped about and covered some of this already. I think we've touched upon it, but a key point is if you're not just relying on someone's individual brilliance, the way to get it to work is to incubate it in some way in another part of the business. And that's the other one that definitely have seen, you mentioned ZX Ventures earlier. It's a good example of that, but increasingly the bigger CPG brands who do it well and understand how to do it is that actually how can we incubate it somewhere else that has less red tape, is given the license to test and learn and iterate, and that's when the success is based more on it's not necessarily based on profitability, but it's based on, as you say, top line growth, but also almost slightly more intangible, but how quickly can we learn and how quickly can we kind of take those learnings and embed them into other areas. So ZX, but equally Unilever have done it with Unilever Ventures to an extent. Everyone now has some sort of separate hub, and I think that actually for marketplaces is going to be increasingly important.
Yeah. So are you seeing, as part of, the ZX or this, the Diageo equivalent of Distill Ventures or the Mondelez Snack Futures example, it's kind of the incubation arm. Do you see that also investing in route to market? So new channels like an Instacart or an Uber or a Deliveroo or something like that? Or is it purely category innovation?
Yeah, no, I think it should. I think it should look at all of those things. And I think one of the problems CPGs have had in the past is, if I would look at a lot of the recruitment we would do a year or 18 months ago, brands would be saying, right, 80% of your role is Amazon, Ocado, Pure Play, whatever else, wherever else it is that we operate. 20% of your role is white space, and that includes all of that. But I've not seen that succeed, because, lo and behold, 99% of your time ends up getting taken up by, the stuff that makes you money right now. And that 20% becomes actually, I never really have the time or the headspace to look at it. But I think it's a nice idea, and it's a nice kind of almost way to sell a job. Oh, you'll have 20, the old 20% of your time spent looking at just fun new stuff, but it never materializes. And that's when nothing, progress never happens. So I think you need to pull it out. Or if you don't, it needs to be one person who's given license and freedom for that to be the entirety of their job.
Absolutely. And I think, we've got 1 minute left. So I'm going to leave us with another topic for potentially another day. And those of you that can stay on, we can keep going. Is I wonder if there's a difference between privately owned companies and the KPIs for success versus publicly traded companies and the KPIs. I mean, obviously, short-term volume-centric promotions obviously is going to continue to happen within publicly traded companies. But I'm wondering if either massive family-owned companies or privately held companies, or the small digital native brands like you were discussing earlier, Andy, since they're either self-funded or venture-funded, if they have a different ability to trade profit for volume. They don't have to hit volume targets. They have to hit profit targets instead. Anyway, that's another day. One last question from Luke, and then we'll close it down. Who, in our view, are the brands with the most advanced in their approach to the marketplace, like ZX Ventures, AB InBev, things like that? Who are you seeing, Andy, as the most advanced in this space?
I think it's a difficult one, because actually there'd be some brands, the ones who are most advanced, I would say, are brands that most of us wouldn't have heard of. So like if you look at, and maybe this isn't exactly what Luke's asking, but there's a brand like Domu, who are a market, Domu have a brand, DOMU, look them up. I don't know how much they do, but it's probably, north of 100 million purely on marketplace. And again, it's one of those brands that you wouldn't know a lot about. So actually, as a real example of someone really good in it, they are. But if you're asking the bigger kind of CPG brands who are trying to access it, then yeah, ZX would be one. I think you look at someone like, over recent years, Reckitt, PepsiCo have done increasingly good jobs and businesses who've pulled out eCommerce into its own center of excellence, and that allows for that. But even stuff you wouldn't necessarily think, like Mountain Warehouse, I think have some a really good marketplace business, and you wouldn't necessarily, it's not a big name that would always spring to mind, and I know they're into retail business, but yeah, they're someone who I would point to as actually having a lot of really good people.
To build on that, I would say from my experience as well, looking at some of the multi-channel retailers that like apparel fashion brands that have their own high street retail, they have their own fulfillment, they have their own way to track multi-channel sales and things like that. If they have a dedicated 3P relationship with an Amazon or an eBay, then they do a fantastic job because they're used to the item level merchandising requirements for how that works. The other one I would put in there is, of course, Anchor, the consumer electronics brand, which is now a $1 billion brand, and it started on Amazon 3P. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will close it down. So thank you, everyone who stuck around for an extra 2 minutes. We really appreciate it. As always, you can see all of the webinars, this one, as well as all of our past ones on our website. Stay tuned for the post-holiday one. We promise to do something that is not a Black Friday recap because we appreciate the fact that you will be inundated with them, and we promise to do something different. We're just not sure what it is yet. So if you have an idea, something to dig into, maybe it's the private versus publicly traded company question, shoot me an email. Of course, connect with me, connect with Andy on LinkedIn. Andy is prolific on LinkedIn. Absolutely fantastic. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, Steve. Cheers.